A black Navy SEAL named Calvin Maddox was wrongly accused and dragged into a courtroom that had no intention of hearing the truth. The racist judge didn't ask questions. She gave orders. And in front of everyone, she forced him to kneel. He said nothing. He just obeyed. But just when it seemed like injustice had won, a U.S. senator walked into the courtroom, and everything changed. What would you have done in Calvin's place? Comment below. Then stay with us, because what happened next left the entire room speechless. It was raining the morning Calvin Maddox walked into the county courthouse. Not just rain, the kind of heavy, quiet storm that makes the world feel still, like something's waiting to happen. He didn't carry an umbrella. Didn't rush. Just walked straight through the downpour. Head held level, coat soaked through, as if the weather itself had no say in what kind of day this would be. He didn't wear his Navy uniform. That was intentional. He had his reasons. The uniform draws attention. It tells a story before you can speak. And today, Calvin didn't come to tell stories. He came to listen, quietly, cautiously, and only when it was absolutely necessary. Inside the courthouse, it was warm and dry, but no less heavy. The gallery was full, unusually full for a midweek hearing. All white faces, older folks, familiar with one another. They didn't talk when he entered. They didn't have to. Their silence said more than words ever could. Heads tilted slightly. Eyes followed him like they were waiting for him to prove their suspicions right. Somewhere in the second row, a man whispered to his wife, just low enough that he thought Calvin wouldn't hear. But Calvin's heard worse in war zones, and he could read lips just fine. He's probably here for assault. The woman didn't respond, just pressed her purse tighter to her chest. Calvin said nothing. He didn't flinch. His boots made soft thuds against the polished wood floor as he found the seat assigned to him by the bailiff. Front row. Right side, closest to the judge's bench. Of course, no defense attorney had greeted him yet. No one in uniform stood by his side. He sat alone. And still, no one had said his name out loud. Not since he walked through the doors. It didn't matter. They didn't need to know his name to judge him. They only needed to see that he was black, big, calm, and not afraid. That last part unnerved them the most. Because when a black man walks into a white courtroom with his shoulders square and his mouth closed, people start to wonder what he's hiding. And Calvin? Calvin wasn't hiding a thing, but he also wasn't offering anything up. He kept his hands folded, eyes steady on the bench, not glancing left or right. There was no nervous twitch, no bouncing knee, no quick breath. He sat the way he learned to sit in ambush, still, patient, waiting for a move that had already been decided. And everyone in that room could feel it. They didn't know who he was, but they didn't like what they saw. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't apologetic, and he sure as hell wasn't intimidated. That made him dangerous, in their eyes. Somewhere toward the back, a white deputy leaned toward another and murmured, half laughing, half wary, "Guy looks like he's ready for war." Calvin heard that too. Still didn't move. Because the truth is, he had already been to war. Real ones. The kind where your enemy hides behind rubble, not behind a bench. This wasn't new. What was new was the way people here dressed up hostility in procedure, in paperwork, in polite nods and gavel taps. That was something even boot camp didn't prepare him for. The judge hadn't entered yet, but Calvin could already feel her presence in the building, like the air pressure shifted the second he walked in. He'd never met her, but he'd heard the stories. Judge Helen Harwood, a white woman with a reputation for ruling fast and talking louder than necessary, especially when it came to young black men she believed needed a lesson. Calvin wasn't young anymore, and he didn't need any more lessons. But something told him he'd be forced to sit through one anyway. Still, he didn't frown, didn't sigh, just sat like time belonged to him. The man they feared never raised his voice, someone would say later. He didn't need to. The courtroom door creaked open just as the rain outside began to ease. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ruskin, a white man in a spotless gray suit, strode in like he'd already won. He didn't look at Calvin. Not once. His eyes skimmed the room like he was walking into a performance, not a proceeding. The files in his hand were thin, but his tone, when he cleared his throat to speak, was heavy, calculated. The state of Alabama versus Calvin Maddox. Assault, disorderly conduct, interference with law enforcement. Ruskin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His confidence came not from facts, but from the system wrapped around him like tailored fabric. Smooth, silent, and stitched in privilege. Mr. Maddox, he continued, pacing slowly, is a former military man, trained, aggressive, and clearly unable to adjust to civilian life. The incident occurred outside a local grocery store, where Mr. Maddox took it upon himself to intervene in a neighborhood dispute, unprovoked. Calvin blinked slowly, not because he was surprised, but because hearing the truth bent so precisely into a lie still had weight. Unprovoked? The fight he stopped was between two men screaming threats at a young mother, his neighbor, cornering her near her car. One of them had a knife. The cops hadn't arrived. Calvin had. He didn't strike first. He disarmed and de-escalated. Without a gun, without force. But none of that was in the file Ruskin now waved like a moral flag. And in the process, Ruskin added, he struck one of the men hard enough to cause a concussion. Then, when officers arrived, Mr. Maddox resisted questioning, asserting he had nothing to explain. That last part was true. He had said that. But not out of arrogance. Out of disbelief. When the police arrived, they barely spoke to the woman crying behind him. They went straight for the black man with wide shoulders and calm eyes. That told him everything. Across the aisle, Calvin's court-appointed lawyer, a white man maybe in his early 30s, tie askew, briefcase still latched, nodded along to Ruskin's claims. Not once did he interrupt, not even a furrow in his brow. He looked resigned, as if this wasn't the first time he'd been given a case like this, and expected it to end the same way. Calvin sat still, jaw tight, eyes locked on the floor, but something in his chest stirred. Not rage, he'd buried that long ago. Not fear, he'd faced worse. It was something colder. Recognition. He'd seen this play before. A room full of people pretending not to know what they really knew, pretending this was about justice, pretending the truth needed a filter. And then came the moment he didn't plan. He looked up and spoke. That's not what happened. His voice was steady, low, clear, like a man who knew he had nothing to hide. A few people in the gallery turned their heads, surprised not by what he said, but that he spoke at all. And then the gavel came down. Thwack. Judge Harwood, white, stiff-backed and unmoved, had finally arrived. Mr. Maddox, she said, glaring over her glasses, you will speak only when addressed. This is a court of law, not a military outpost. There was a pause, long enough for everyone to feel what wasn't being said. Not a military outpost. That wasn't about procedure. That was personal. She knew he was a SEAL. She knew what that uniform meant. And she made sure everyone knew that in her courtroom it meant nothing. Ruskin didn't react to the judge's rebuke. If anything, he seemed pleased. Like the script was unfolding exactly as planned. And for a moment Calvin felt the weight again. Not from the charges, not from the room, but from the silence. The kind of silence that comes when you realize the truth has been politely escorted out of the building, without ever being asked to speak. He glanced around. Eyes, faces, nods, a few uncomfortable shifts, but no protest. Not yet. This was how injustice dressed itself now, in calm voices, clean suits, and courtroom protocols. It didn't need to shout. It just needed to speak first, and loud enough. And it had. For now. The rain had stopped, but inside that courtroom, it was still storming. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ruskin, white, confident, and unbothered, stood tall behind his podium. The corners of his mouth curled just slightly upward like a man who knew the next move and was enjoying the silence before he made it. Your Honor, Ruskin said, voice smooth as linen, if the defendant continues to show a lack of cooperation, we are prepared to elevate the charges to felony obstruction. The word felony hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what it meant. It didn't just carry time. It carried stigma. A stain that followed a man long after he served it. Judge Harwood leaned forward, elbows resting neatly on the bench. Her lips didn't move for a second. She just looked at Calvin Maddox, long and hard, as if waiting to see the slightest flicker of fear in his eyes. None came, but that didn't stop her. Mr. Maddox, she said slowly, firmly, this court orders you to kneel, for the record. There was no gasp, no outcry, just a long, low silence, like someone had knocked the wind out of the room without making a sound. Calvin didn't move. Not yet. He just turned his head slightly, not toward the judge, not toward Ruskin, but toward the gallery. Toward the crowd of white faces who'd watched this play out like a Sunday drama. He didn't scan for sympathy. He wasn't looking for rescue. and then he saw him. A boy. No more than 9, maybe 10, sitting next to his mother near the back. Brown skin, wide eyes, shoulders stiff, a familiar face. His neighbor's son. The same boy who once asked him what it meant to be brave. The boy looked at him now, not with fear, but confusion, like something inside him was breaking. Calvin exhaled, just once. And then he knelt. Not fast, not ashamed. He moved with the same control he once used in combat. Like every vertebra had a purpose. Like his body was his own, even now. His back stayed straight, his chin stayed up. He didn't bow. He just lowered himself slowly, deliberately onto one knee, in front of the court, the system, and the people who thought they had won. The gavel struck. "Let the record show," Harwood said coldly. The defendant complied. There was a quiet rustle in the gallery. Not much, just the sound of discomfort shifting in wooden seats. But it was enough. Someone whispered, sharp enough to be heard 2 rows up. "Is this justice?" A woman near the aisle reached for her coat, as if she couldn't sit still another second. The deputy standing by the wall tensed, hand inching toward his belt, not because of a threat, but because he couldn't name what was happening. The room wasn't erupting, it was unraveling. Ruskin remained still, but the smugness in his face had thinned. He hadn't planned for this. He'd planned for resistance, outrage, protest. But submission? Dignified, silent submission? That unsettled something. Because this wasn't a man who had been broken. This was a man who had chosen his silence. And that choice made their power feel small. Calvin didn't speak, didn't flinch. His eyes remained ahead, still, almost steady, but inside him something churned. This wasn't combat. This was something colder. This was ceremony. The ritual humiliation of a black man in a white courtroom, dressed in legal language, backed by marble walls, and justified by the weight of a wooden bench. And yet, even as the system tried to fold him into itself, make him shrink, make him cower, he did not give them what they wanted. He knelt, but he did not surrender. And the room felt it, not loud, not fast, but like a crack beneath glass, spreading quietly, growing with every breath that followed. "You may rise," Harwood said after a moment, brushing her fingers against the bench as if wiping something off it. But Calvin stayed exactly where he was, still, proud, unmoving. For just another second, until the sound of the boy's mother whispering, "Let's go," broke the spell. She was standing, holding her son's hand. They were leaving, quietly but unmistakably. Others began to shift, unsure if they should follow. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law anymore. It had become a mirror. And not everyone liked what they saw. You don't just walk away from war. You carry it, in silence, in scars no one sees, in the space between every breath. And for Calvin Maddox, that weight didn't come from what he lost. It came from what he obeyed. Long before a judge made him kneel in a courtroom, Calvin had gone to his knees in a place no cameras ever reached. It was called Ghost Echo, a mission that never made the news. And it wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be clean, quiet, quick. 6 men dropped behind enemy lines. Intel said it would save lives. A short window, 1 shot. Calvin was in command. Young, disciplined, respected. He'd earned that, but what he didn't earn was the order. It came from a distant command post, some colonel staring at a satellite feed miles away. The call: split the unit, flank left, move fast, trust the target had shifted. Calvin hesitated, every instinct screamed to hold, but protocol said otherwise. So he obeyed. 3 men didn't make it back. One of them was Lucas Bishop. Black, just like him, grew up 2 towns over. A mechanic's son, funny, loyal, newly married, a man who followed orders too. Calvin carried his body out alone. He never forgot the stillness, the heat, the sound of nothing. They tried to give him a medal afterward, the Navy Cross. He didn't show up, didn't answer the phone, didn't accept the folded letter that came in the mail. Instead, he filed for early separation. Cited personal reasons. No one pushed, because some wounds don't bleed, they just linger. He moved to a small southern town where nobody asked questions. Bought a truck that coughed every morning but never quit. Rebuilt the old gym, showed up at food drives, helped fix broken fences, never talked about the Navy, never corrected anyone when they assumed he was just a quiet guy with strong hands and a past. He liked it that way. Because the truth wasn't something you could tell over coffee. It wasn't something you explained without trembling. He stopped wearing his uniform, folded it once, sealed it in a box, Not because he was ashamed, but because he no longer believed in the shine. He didn't stop loving his country, but he had stopped believing the system knew how to love him back. He had seen too much of how obedience could cost lives, of how silence was sometimes safer than righteousness, and of how medals didn't stop bullets. When people in town thanked him vaguely for his service, he nodded politely, never adding detail. When teenagers asked him if he'd seen combat, he'd smile and change the subject. But when trouble happened, when a neighbor's child went missing, when a veteran was found on the porch in winter, when a single mother's car stalled on a rainy highway, they called Calvin. He always came, always fixed, never asked for thanks. To them, he was dependable. A man who stood back, kept to himself, didn't need recognition. But they didn't know why, because Calvin wasn't hiding from his past. He was guarding it. He knew what systems could do, what they had cost. He'd watched good men get buried under silence and orders. So when the police that day at the grocery store didn't even question the white man with the knife, when they went straight for him, the one who de-escalated, who'd intervened to protect, something old in Calvin stirred. He didn't argue, didn't shout, because the system doesn't fear men who raise their voices. It fears the ones who don't flinch. And when the court later tried to twist his silence into guilt, they never imagined that silence had once held together men under fire. That silence had carried the names of the fallen. That silence was earned. He stopped wearing medals, not because he forgot what they meant, but because he remembered too well. He remembered every mistake branded in policy, every apology signed in folded flags, every salute that came too late. And so he stayed quiet. Not from weakness, but because the louder the world got, the more he understood. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is listen long enough to know who's lying. Some silences are louder than gunfire. Calvin Maddox still knelt at the center of the courtroom, his hands resting loosely on his thighs, his spine straight, his eyes cast forward, but not down. The wood beneath his knees was old, scratched, cold. Still, he didn't shift, didn't flinch. He wasn't kneeling for the judge, and he sure as hell wasn't kneeling for the prosecutor. He was kneeling for something they couldn't see. Behind him, in the third row from the back, sat a boy no one noticed. Brown skin, slight shoulders, a hoodie zipped to the neck even though the courtroom's air conditioning barely worked. His feet dangled just above the floor. He didn't speak, didn't blink much. His name was Jeremiah, 9 years old. The boy whose mother had been shoved against a shelf in the corner store by a man twice her size until Calvin stepped in, until Calvin disarmed him, quietly, without hurting anyone. The police hadn't believed her, or the store camera, or the bruises on her arms. They arrested the wrong man, and now that man was kneeling in court. Jeremiah knew the truth, but he also knew no one would ask him. They never did. So he took a pen from his pocket, the kind Calvin had given him months ago, with a silver clip and worn grip. He grabbed the back of an old envelope from his mom's purse and wrote carefully, in his best block letters, like Calvin had taught him. "You saved my mom. I saw it." No one saw him do it. Not the bailiff, not the prosecutor, not even his own mother. But Calvin did. He didn't turn his head, just saw it, saw the boy's small hands pressing the note flat against his lap. And then Calvin nodded, once, subtle, barely there. But Jeremiah saw it, and for him it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a promise, one that didn't need words, one that meant, "I'm not broken." And maybe even, one day you won't have to kneel for anyone. No one else in the courtroom noticed the exchange, but the room felt different. A shift you couldn't explain, like air moving before a storm. Maybe it was the way the judge's voice cracked slightly as she flipped the next page, or how ADA Mark Ruskin, the white prosecutor, cleared his throat twice before continuing. His confidence dimmed, if only for a moment. Maybe it was the elderly woman near the exit who leaned forward and whispered, "This don't feel right," to no one in particular. Or the deputy who, for a second, looked at Calvin like he'd seen someone familiar, not a threat. But the most important change wasn't in them. It was in the boy. Jeremiah didn't fidget anymore. His shoulders sat a little higher. His legs didn't swing beneath the bench. He watched Calvin not with fear but with focus. The kind of focus boys use when they decide who they want to grow up to be. And Calvin, kneeling in silence, bruised by injustice but not bowed by it, became something Jeremiah had never seen in real life. A man who knelt, not in defeat, but in defiance. Some men kneel for justice, the narrator's voice might say here. Others, so a child never has to. And in that moment, it was clear. Calvin wasn't just enduring the weight of injustice. He was shouldering it, so someone smaller didn't have to. The problem with truth is that it doesn't yell, it waits, it endures. It shows up quietly, dressed in reason, hoping someone in power is still listening. But in that courtroom, no one was. The state's witness was called to the stand, a man named Daniel Kerr, white, mid-40s, with a voice too polished for someone who claimed to have seen a knife fight from the other end of a grocery aisle. He raised his hand, took the oath, and lied. He claimed he saw Calvin Maddox strike the other man first. Said Calvin was agitated, threatening, aggressive. Said he felt unsafe watching him. There was no footage to support it. The store's cameras had been conveniently under maintenance. The only one who had recorded anything, a teenage girl, had her phone confiscated and the footage lost in evidence. Still, no one interrupted Kerr's testimony. Not the judge, not the prosecutor. They let him speak, uninterrupted, as if truth came in skin tones. Calvin, still seated in silence, watched him. Not with anger, not even surprise, just tired recognition. As if he'd seen this same play before, acted out with new actors, new lighting, but always the same ending. When it was over, the judge glanced at Calvin. "Do you wish to respond to the witness statement?" she asked, more out of procedure than invitation. Calvin looked forward. His voice, when it came, was calm, clear. "You weren't there," he said simply. Not loud, not defensive, just a fact, standing by itself. That's when ADA Mark Ruskin, the white prosecutor, leaned forward with that half-smirk he'd worn all morning. "And you're not a lawyer," he replied. The courtroom laughed, just enough to sting. The kind of laughter that doesn't come from humor, but from the safety of numbers. Harwood, the white judge, didn't correct him. She didn't address the insult. She simply raised her gavel and struck it once against the wood. "This court recognizes the state's testimony as valid. We will move forward," she said, as if moving forward didn't mean moving past the truth. The moment slipped past like a door closing slowly. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, it felt like it never would. Calvin didn't look away. He didn't object. Because he'd already learned what happened to men like him when they raised their voices in rooms not meant for them. There was no cross-examination. His public defender sat silent, tapping his pen in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like retreat. And that's when the weight settled in. Not just on Calvin's shoulders, but on the room itself. People in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The woman from earlier whispered again, "That boy saved someone. Why don't that matter?" No one answered her. Maybe they didn't hear. Maybe they didn't want to. But Calvin did. He heard it all. And in that moment, the silence he carried was not surrender. It was survival. Truth doesn't fail, he thought to himself. It just gets scheduled out of time. Pushed to the bottom of the docket, ignored into paperwork, dismissed before it even arrives. Because the law doesn't always need to lie to be cruel. Sometimes it just needs to look away. And that's what this courtroom had become. Not a place of judgment, but of quiet, well-dressed avoidance. Calvin sat back, not defeated, but knowing. He knew that justice wasn't about the truth you carried. It was about whether the people in power ever intended to hear it. And on that day, they didn't. Sometimes justice doesn't kick down doors. Sometimes she opens them quietly, and everything changes. The courtroom was suffocating in its silence. Calvin Maddox was still seated, hands cuffed before him, the dull ache in his knees now replaced by a deeper weight. The kind that doesn't show up on x-rays. His eyes stared ahead, past the judge, past the sneer on Ruskin's face, past the glares and whispers. Then, the door creaked open. At first, no one turned. Doors opened all the time in courtrooms. Late jurors, tired clerks, confused visitors. But this time, heels clicked on the floor. Deliberate, even, certain. People turned, one by one. Whispers started before the mind could register the name, and then the entire room paused. Standing in the doorway was Senator Diana Klein, tall, poised, white suit immaculate despite the rain outside. The kind of woman whose presence isn't announced, it's felt, like barometric pressure before a storm. She didn't glance around nervously. She didn't flinch. She walked forward with a folder tucked under one arm, her other hand holding her phone like she'd just come off a classified call. Her expression didn't carry anger, it carried finality. And when her eyes met Calvin's, he blinked. Just once. Harwood, the white judge, sat up straighter. Her voice, which had been firm all morning, now had the wobble of uncertainty. "Senator, this is highly irregular." Diana didn't answer. She simply walked past the prosecutor's table, past the stunned bailiff, past the stunned gasps of the gallery, and placed the folder on the judge's bench. It was navy blue, stamped with a gold seal, marked classified, eyes only. She said just 2 words, "You need to read this." Harwood hesitated, then opened it. What she read drained the blood from her face. Calvin Maddox, commander of Operation Ghost Echo, a mission so black ops it barely existed on Pentagon records. Decorated twice off record, one of only 3 SEALs to lead a cross-border civilian extraction without loss of life. And on page 4, a signature. Hers, Diana Klein's, because he had saved her life. 15 years ago, in a village not found on maps. She'd been there on a diplomatic visit that went sideways. He'd been the nameless voice in her earpiece guiding her out. He never asked for thanks, never said his name. Until now, she never knew his face. But when the headlines surfaced of a black man being forced to kneel in a court in her district, something made her dig. And she found him. Now the courtroom sat frozen. Ruskin stood, pale. "Your Honor, this has nothing to do with..." Diana cut him off without raising her voice. "Everything in that file predates your career by a decade. You don't have the clearance to question it." Then she turned. Finally, facing the gallery, her voice quiet, but carrying all the weight of truth sharpened by silence. "This man," she said, "has done more for this country in shadows than most do in daylight. You may not like how he looks. You may not understand how he moves through the world, but make no mistake, when this courtroom forced him to kneel, you didn't humble him." She paused. "You shamed yourselves." No one moved, not even the gavel. Harwood's mouth opened, then closed. Ruskin fumbled for a response, but his tongue stayed behind. And Calvin? He remained seated, still in cuffs, still quiet, still composed. But his eyes, those still, unblinking eyes, met Diana's. And for the first time that day, they softened. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, he just looked human again. Diana turned, heels clicking once more, and headed for the door. She didn't need to stay. The message had landed. And as the door closed behind her, someone in the gallery whispered what everyone was thinking. Sometimes justice wears heels and carries a file marked classified. The courtroom remained still long after Senator Diana Klein had left. It wasn't just her words that lingered. It was the tone. The quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to scream to shift the entire room. Calvin Maddox didn't move. He didn't flinch, still seated, still cuffed, still silent. But the silence no longer felt like defeat. It felt earned. Judge Harwood stared down at the file in front of her like it had turned to stone in her hands. There were no objections now, no gavel strikes. Only that uneasy awareness that the system had been caught mid-act, and someone outside of it had just pulled back the curtain. Kongtovian Datrang, Mark Ruskin, finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than before, but still carrying that same defensive sharpness. "I prosecuted what I was handed." His eyes flicked around the courtroom, looking for backup. There was none. Diana had stayed, just a few feet off to the side now, arms crossed, watching him. Not with fury, but with disappointment deeper than any insult. "You read what you wanted to see," she said, voice even, "and ignored everything that didn't fit the picture you'd already painted." Ruskin stiffened. "I followed the law." Diana didn't argue. She only shook her head, slow and firm. "No, Mark. You followed your comfort." A murmur rippled through the crowd. At that moment, Calvin turned slightly in his seat, just enough to glance at the back of the courtroom. His eyes found no one in particular, but they carried weight, not anger, not even accusation, just a tired clarity. And somehow, that silence, that calm refusal to speak, not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to, said more than any statement ever could. Ruskin looked away first. Diana stepped forward, just close enough that the whole room could hear, but not so close as to be confrontational. 15 years ago, she said quietly, this man pulled me out of a kill zone in the dead of night. No lights, no backup, no promise of recognition. He asked for nothing, not a medal, not a letter, not even my name. She paused, looking down at Calvin, her voice breaking just slightly. I never spoke of it, not out of shame, but because he didn't need to be thanked. He only needed someone to remember. And I did. She turned again to face the bench. But now I realize silence is a luxury I could afford. He can't. Judge Harwood swallowed hard, her hands still resting on the file. Her eyes didn't lift. Ruskin didn't speak again. And Calvin? He didn't need to, because the truth, once spoken out loud, had filled every inch of the courtroom. It didn't ask permission. It didn't knock gently. It just showed up, in heels with a folder, and a memory sharper than any accusation. Some truths, Diana said softly, more to herself than anyone, clear a room louder than any verdict. The moment lingered. And then, like the final exhale after a storm, the courtroom finally began to breathe again. The photo spread like wildfire. Calvin, still in civilian clothes, kneeling in a courtroom, head held high, back straight, eyes not on his accusers, but on a boy in the gallery. The boy's small handwritten note, crumpled but visible, sat beside him. You saved my mom. By morning, it was everywhere. Retired Navy commanders began speaking out. Civil rights groups reposted the photo with 3 words. This is America? But it wasn't just the internet reacting. Something deeper shifted, like a cold draft sweeping through stone walls that had stood too long untouched. Judge Harwood, a white woman who'd ruled that courtroom like a fortress, made no public statement. She didn't offer an apology, but by midweek, she quietly filed for an indefinite leave of absence, citing mental exhaustion. No trial, no investigation, just absence. But no one needed paperwork to know what really happened. Her name had already become a symbol, not of justice, but of how justice can kneel to pride. Assistant District Attorney Mark Ruskin, also white, didn't disappear. He did interviews, leaned forward in his suit, tried to explain. I prosecuted what was handed to me, he said, voice crisp, practiced. But facts began leaking. 3 older cases, buried deep in archives, showed similar patterns. Missing testimonies from black witnesses, charges padded with flimsy accusations. No smoking gun, just a trail of silence and an ugly shape forming in the smoke. A major paper ran the headline, "The man who always won, as long as the defendant was black." He wasn't disbarred, wasn't indicted, but the phone stopped ringing, his name stopped opening doors, and he knew it. Because injustice doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just stops calling you back. And Calvin? He never spoke to the press. Diana Klein, the U.S. Senator who'd walked into that courtroom and shattered its performance of power, asked if he planned to sue. Calvin shook his head. Justice isn't punishment, he said softly. It's memory. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want a courtroom of his own. He wanted the image to stay. The boy, the silence, the kneeling, the truth. Because some men are never meant to kneel, and when they do, the whole world remembers why they shouldn't have had to. Sometimes power ends not with a trial, but with a photograph. And this time, no one could look away. There was no parade when Calvin Maddox walked out of the courthouse. No reporters swarming the steps, no cameras chasing his every breath. Just the rain again, soft and steady, as if it had waited all this time to pick up where it left off. He didn't rush. He never did. His steps were slow, grounded, not in pride, not even in pain, but in something heavier. Clarity. The kind that comes only after you've stood still long enough to feel the weight of silence do its work. No one followed him, but not because they didn't care. Inside, the gallery was still half full. Eyes watched him go, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. Because once a man kneels, not out of guilt, but out of restraint, and rises again with no fury in his hands, people remember that. They remember what it looked like, what it made them feel, and they don't rush to disturb it. Just before he stepped through the doors, a boy broke from the aisle. The same boy who'd held up a folded note, the one whose mother Calvin had protected. This time, the boy held something else. A small, tightly folded American flag. Not from a soldier's grave, but from a classroom shelf where it had sat untouched for years. The boy reached up, both hands shaking a little. They said you earned this. Calvin looked down, not at the flag, but at the boy's face. He didn't smile. He just nodded, slowly, as if to say, "You're the reason I didn't yell. You're the reason I came." He took the flag and held it close, not pressed to his chest, but resting gently against his side, like a memory you don't parade, only protect. A woman's voice, older, cracked like dry leaves, rose from the back. You made us all stand taller. She didn't say it to be heard. She said it because someone had to. And that was enough. The courthouse didn't change that day. The walls didn't crumble. The gavel wasn't retired. The names on the doors didn't get replaced. But something inside did shift. Because when the court reopened a week later, no one sat in the chair Calvin had been forced to kneel beside. Not out of fear. Not out of shame. But because some chairs carry the shape of the last person who occupied them. And no one, not even the boldest, dared to try and fit themselves into that silence. Calvin didn't give interviews. He didn't write a memoir. He didn't campaign or sue or explain. He went home. To a house too quiet, a past too full, and a community that finally knew. Not what he'd done, but who he was. You don't need a microphone to make a room remember you. Some men leave no footprints, but the ground never forgets where they stood. Sometimes the quietest man in the room leaves behind the loudest echo. Calvin Maddox didn't fight back with fists or loud words. His silence stood taller than any accusation. In a courtroom built to shame him, he reminded us what quiet strength and unshakable dignity really look like. This wasn't just about one man. It was about all of us, and the kind of justice we choose to believe in. If this story touched you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, meaningful storytelling. Your support isn't just a number. It's the reason we keep creating stories that echo with truth, courage, and the kind of quiet that changes everything. At Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories. We help you remember the ones the world tries to forget. Thank you for watching. Now let's carry this one forward, together.